the autumn of 1888, Arthur Pendleton was a man drowning in his own delusions. He lived at an elevation of 10,000 feet, high in the brutal, jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. Arthur was 34 years old, but the thin air and the relentless, freezing wind had weathered his face into the tough, deep-lined leather of an old man. He was a prospector, but more accurately, he was a failure. For 6 years, Arthur had swung a heavy iron pickaxe into the solid granite of a claim he called the Golden Promise. The name was a cruel joke. The mine had yielded nothing but gray rock, freezing groundwater, and a crushing, suffocating mountain of debt. He owed the mining supply company in town $400, an astronomical sum in those days. His credit was cut off. His clothes were essentially rags held together by trail dust and stubbornness. He lived in a one-room cabin made of unpeeled pine logs. It didn't even have a wooden door, just a heavy, grease-stained canvas tarp nailed over the entrance to keep out the mountain lions and the blizzards. Arthur was staring down the barrel of absolute ruin. He was lonely, he was freezing, and he was deeply, profoundly ashamed. He wanted, just for a moment, to feel like the man he had intended to be when he traveled west. He wanted to feel successful. So, he opened a copy of a matrimonial gazette, dipped his pen in a bottle of half-frozen ink, and lied. He wrote a letter to an agency in Boston. He did not describe the canvas door. He did not mention the $400 he owed to a ruthless mercantile owner. Instead, Arthur wrote a masterpiece of Gilded Age fiction. He described the Golden Promise as a booming, highly lucrative silver and gold operation. He described a sprawling, 2-story Victorian home nestled in a pristine alpine valley. He described himself as a wealthy, established mining baron seeking a refined, educated woman from the East to share in his immense fortune and manage his grand estate. He sealed the letter. He sent it east. He knew he was committing a terrible fraud, but he justified it with the prospector's ultimate disease, the belief that the very next strike of the pickaxe would make it all true. As the historian and pioneer journalist Louise Clapp observed from a freezing mining camp in 1851, the gold fever is a madness that rots a man's character long before it rots his lungs. It makes liars out of honest men and beggars out of kings. Arthur's lie found its way to a cramped, freezing boarding house in Boston. It found its way to Clara Vance. Clara was 31 years old, and she was running out of time. In the cruel economic machinery of the 19th century, an unmarried woman in her 30s, without family wealth, was entirely disposable. Her father had been a respected merchant who died suddenly, leaving behind nothing but hidden debts. Clara had spent the last 5 years working 12-hour shifts as a seamstress in a dark, poorly ventilated textile shop. She was exhausted to her very bones. She coughed in the mornings. She looked at the older women in the shop, women with bent spines and blind eyes, and she saw her own terrifying future. Clara did not want a grand romance. She wanted a fortress. She wanted a guarantee that she would never freeze or starve in the streets of Boston. She read Arthur's letter. She read about the gold mine, the sprawling estate, and the wealthy baron. She wrote back. Her letters were elegant, practical, and completely devoid of romantic sentimentality. She accepted his proposal. She packed a single leather trunk containing 3 modest dresses, her sewing shears, and her late mother's silver hairbrush. She spent the absolute last of her savings on a one-way ticket on the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. She expected a savior. She found a ghost. The train dropped Clara at the depot in Silverton, Colorado, in the middle of a swirling, biting November snowstorm. She stood on the wooden platform, shivering in her thin eastern wool coat, looking for a polished carriage and a wealthy gentleman in a tailored suit. Instead, a man approached her leading a half-starved pack mule. Arthur stood before her. He was covered in rock dust. His beard was wild and unkempt. His coat was torn at the shoulder, revealing the frayed flannel underneath. He smelled of stale sweat, cheap coffee, and desperation. He looked at her, holding the tintype photograph she had sent. "Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice cracking from disuse and deep sudden shame. Clara stared at him. Her highly logical, mathematical mind processed the frayed coat, the starving mule, and the absence of a carriage in less than 3 seconds. The floor of her world simply dropped away. "You are Mr. Pendleton," she stated. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "I am," Arthur replied, unable to meet her eyes. "Where is your carriage?" "The claim. The claim is too high up the mountain for wheels. We must walk." The walk took 4 hours. They ascended into the thin, freezing air of the Rockies. Every step Clara took in her thin city shoes was a physical agony, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological terror expanding in her chest. When they finally reached the clearing, Arthur stopped. Clara looked past him. She saw the nameless cabin. She saw the canvas tarp flapping pathetically in the freezing wind. She saw the dark, gaping hole in the side of the mountain behind it, surrounded by piles of useless gray rock. There was no Victorian estate. There was no empire. Arthur dropped her trunk into the snow. He finally looked at her, his face a mask of defensive pride. "The vein is just a few feet deeper," he blurted out, the lie tumbling from his lips like a reflex. "I hit quartz yesterday. The gold is right behind it. I just need a little more time." Clara did not scream. She did not fall to her knees and weep. She walked past him, pushed the canvas tarp aside, and stepped into the cabin. It was a dark freezing box. There was a crude iron stove in the corner, unlit. There was a table made of split logs, and on that table, sitting squarely in the center, was a heavy leather ledger book. Clara walked to the table. She opened the ledger. Her father had been a merchant. She knew how to read numbers. She ran her finger down the long red columns of ink. Provisions, dynamite, pickaxes, interest, more interest. She closed the book. She turned around to face Arthur, who had followed her inside, standing awkwardly by the entrance. "You do not own a gold mine, Mr. Pendleton," Clara said, her eyes dropping to a terrifying absolute calm. "You own a $400 debt, and you live in a grave." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I told you, the strike is coming. You don't understand the mining business." "I understand arithmetic," Clara fired back, her eyes blazing in the dim light. "I understand that I spent every penny I had in this world to travel to a man who does not exist. I cannot afford a ticket back to Boston, and you cannot afford to buy me one." It was the raw, brutal truth. They were not bound by love, or even by a wedding vow. They had planned to marry in town, but the snow had prevented it. They were bound by mutual, absolute destitution. They were trapped in a 10 by 10 box of pine logs, 10,000 feet above sea level, with winter closing in. Arthur expected her to break down. He expected hysterics. He was wrong. Clara took off her thin wool coat. She did not cry. She did not. Instead, she walked over to the crude iron stove. "Where is the firewood?" she demanded. The first week was a masterclass in silent, suffocating hostility. They were two cornered animals sharing a cage. Arthur would wake up before dawn, silently drink a cup of boiling water flavored with old coffee grounds, and disappear into the black hole of his mind. He would swing his pickaxe for 12 hours, driven by a manic, desperate need to find a single nugget of gold to prove he wasn't a total fraud. He would return after dark, his hands bleeding, his body exhausted, and place pieces of useless, barren rock on the table. Clara would ignore him. She spent her days aggressively cleaning the dirt floor, trying to patch the drafts in the log walls with mud and pine needles. She was terrified, but her fear manifested as cold, calculated rage. She inventoried his meager supplies: a half sack of flour, some salt pork, a tin of lard. They had enough food for 3 weeks. The winter would last for 5 months. They were going to starve. The crisis arrived on the 9th day. It did not come in the form of a blizzard. It came in the form of 2 men on horseback. They were collection agents from the Mercantile in Silverton. They rode up to the cabin, heavily armed and entirely lacking in sympathy. Arthur stepped out of the mine, his pickaxe in hand, his face pale. The lead agent, a massive man in a bearskin coat, didn't even dismount. "Time's up, Pendleton," he shouted over the wind. "The boss is calling the debt. You haven't made an interest payment in 3 months. We're foreclosing on the claim. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your gear and walk down this mountain, or we will throw you down it." Arthur gripped the handle of his pickaxe. His knuckles turned white. This was his entire life. This was his pride. He was prepared to swing the iron, take a bullet, and die in the snow. It was easier than admitting absolute defeat. Before Arthur could move, the canvas tarp of the cabin was thrown aside. Clara stepped out into the freezing wind. She was wearing a heavy canvas apron over her ruined city dress. Her hands were covered in flour. She looked at the 2 armed men. She did not look at Arthur. "Who holds the paper on this debt?" Clara asked, her voice cutting through the thin mountain air like a straight razor. The lead agent frowned, looking down at this fierce, unexpected woman. "Silas Vance, at the main mercantile." "And what is the exact amount required to halt the foreclosure today?" $40, the agent sneered. "Just for the back interest. But unless your husband found a vein of solid gold this morning, lady, you're trespassing." Clara didn't blink. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron. She pulled out a heavy, ornate silver object and held it up. It was her mother's silver hairbrush, the only piece of her past she had kept, the only object of actual value within 50 miles. "This is sterling silver, crafted in Boston," Clara said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "It is worth at least $60. Take it to Mr. Vance. Tell him it covers the back interest. And tell him that the Pendleton claim is no longer operating on credit." The agent stared at the heavy, gleaming silver. He looked at Arthur, who was standing frozen in shock. The agent smirked, leaned down, and snatched the brush from her hand. "That buys you 1 month, lady," the agent said. "We'll be back in December." They turned their horses and rode back down the trail. Arthur stood in the snow, staring at Clara. The silence between them was heavy, profound, and utterly changed. He had lied to bring her here. He had dragged her into his failure, and she had just sold her mother's memory to save his life. "Why?" Arthur whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you do that? You could have let them take it. You could have gone down the mountain with them." Clara turned to face him. Her eyes were not filled with affection. They were filled with absolute, terrifying pragmatism. "If I go down that mountain, I freeze in the streets of Silverton," Clara said evenly. "I bought us 30 days of shelter. But hear me clearly, Mr. Pendleton. The fairy tale is dead. You are not a mining baron, and you will not swing that pickaxe into that useless hole in the ground for another single day." Arthur felt a flare of defensive anger. "That mine is the only way to pay the debt. That mine is a grave," Clara shouted, her composure finally cracking, her voice echoing off the granite peaks. "It is a grave, and I refuse to be buried in it." She took a deep, shuddering breath, regaining her icy control. A prospector's wife, named Lucina Stanley Wilson, who lived through the brutal reality of the Western camps, wrote a truth in her memoirs that stripped away all the romance of this era, Clara said, staring directly into his soul. She wrote, "A man will dig through solid granite for a year, chasing a phantom vein of gold, while a woman will look at the dirt, see what is actually there, and find a way to make it pay." Clara pointed a flower-covered finger down the valley, toward a cluster of distant smoke plumes, rising from a larger, successful mining camp 3 miles away. "There are 200 men in that camp," Clara said. "They are eating hardtack and beans. They have silver in their pockets, and they are desperate for anything that tastes like civilization." She turned and pointed to the crude iron stove inside the cabin. "I can bake 50 loaves of bread a day," Clara stated. "I can make hot, heavy meat pies, but I cannot do it without a constant supply of wood, water, and flour. You are no longer a gold miner, Arthur. You are now the labor for my bakery. You will chop the wood. You will haul the water, and you will carry the bread down that mountain to sell it, because flour pays the debt. Gold is just a ghost." Arthur stood perfectly still. The absolute, staggering magnitude of his emasculation washed over him. The woman he had ordered from a catalog to be his domestic ornament had just seized total control of his life. She had stripped him of his title, his dream, and his autonomy. He looked at the dark hole of the mine. He looked at the heavy pickaxe in his hand. Then he looked at Clara. He saw the fierce, unbroken survival instinct burning in her eyes. He realized, with a sudden crushing clarity, that her plan was real. His plan was a delusion. Arthur did not argue. He lowered the pickaxe. He walked past the mine entrance, walked to the pile of uncut pine logs, picked up the felling axe, and began to chop wood. It was an absolute surrender of power. The next 30 days were a descent into a specific kind of grueling, unglamorous hell. The Pendleton claim transformed from a silent, failing mine into a roaring, high-altitude factory. Clara woke at 3 in the morning. She lived in a constant, suffocating cloud of flour and wood smoke. She kneaded heavy dough until the muscles in her arms screamed. She burned her hands on the iron stove. She cooked massive, savory pies filled with salt pork and wild onions that Arthur managed to forage. Arthur's life became a brutal cycle of physical labor. He chopped cord after cord of dense pine to keep the stove at baking temperature. He hauled heavy buckets of freezing water from the creek. And every afternoon, regardless of the weather, he strapped a massive, heavy wooden frame to his back, loaded it with Clara's fresh bread and pies, and hiked 3 miles through the snow to the neighboring mining camp. The first time Arthur walked into the neighboring camp carrying bread instead of a pickaxe, the other miners laughed. They mocked the fallen baron. They asked him if he was wearing an apron under his coat. Arthur took the mockery in silence. He didn't defend his honor. He simply opened the wooden box. The smell of fresh, hot, perfectly baked bread hit the freezing, exhausted miners. The laughter stopped instantly. Arthur sold every single loaf in 12 minutes. He charged an exorbitant, borderline extortionate price. The miners paid it without hesitation. When Arthur returned to the cabin that night, it was long past dark. Clara was asleep in a chair by the stove, her hands covered in flour, her head slumped in exhaustion. Arthur walked over to the split log table. He reached into his heavy canvas pockets. He began to stack silver coins on the wood. The heavy, metallic clinking sound woke Clara. She opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light of the oil lamp. She looked at the table. There was no gold dust. There were no phantom promises. There was a stack of cold, hard, undeniable silver dollars. Arthur looked at her. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't claim the victory. $32, Arthur said quietly, his voice hoarse from the cold. In one day, Clara stared at the money. Then she looked up at Arthur. His hands were blistered from the axe. His shoulders were slumped from the heavy pack. He looked nothing like the gentleman in the letter. But for the first time since she stepped off the train, Clara did not see a fraud. She saw a partner. "We need more flour," Clara said softly. "I will go to town tomorrow," Arthur replied. That was the actual beginning of their marriage. They never found gold. The golden promise remained a wet, useless hole in the side of the mountain. But by the following spring, Clara and Arthur Pendleton had paid off the $400 debt in its entirety. They didn't stop there. They bought a larger stove. They hired 2 men to run supplies. Within 3 years, they owned a massive, thriving boarding house and bakery in the valley. They became 2 of the most respected, formidable business owners in the San Juan Mountains. The dynamic of their relationship was forged in the death of a beautiful lie. When 2 people are forced into a crucible of survival, the avatars burn away. You cannot pretend to be a wealthy baron when you are hauling water in a blizzard. You cannot pretend to be a fragile parlor girl when you are negotiating the price of a 50-pound sack of flour with a ruthless mercantile agent. We spend so much of our lives terrified of the raw truth. We build facades, we write resumes, we curate profiles, all designed to hide the parts of ourselves we believe are unlovable, incapable, or burdened by debt. We believe that if someone saw the real us, the failures, the scars, fear, they would immediately walk away. But Clara and Arthur discovered the ultimate paradox of human connection. The lie might get them to the train station, but true intimacy, true safety, and true respect can only begin the exact moment the lie collapses. You cannot build a life with a fictional character. You can only build a life with a human being. The people who truly love you will not love you for the grand estate you pretend to own. They will love you for the way you carry the water when the fire needs to be stoked, because the raw truth is always stronger than a beautiful lie. If this story made you stop and think about the masks we wear, I have a question for you. Think deeply about it before you answer. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you were forced to drop a facade with someone? What happened when the raw truth came out? Did it break the relationship, or did it finally make it real? Leave a comment below. I want to read your experiences. Let's talk about it.